1932. Dutch Schultz put a $5,000 bounty on her head and expected her to run. Stephanie St. Clair read the price tag on her own life, and smiled. Then she made a phone call. November 8, 1932. Harlem. The cold came in hard that year, earlier than usual, driving off the last warmth of October and settling over the borough like a held breath. Coal smoke drifted from basement furnaces. The streets of Lenox Avenue were slick and gray. By 7 in the morning, the temperature had not climbed past 26 degrees, and the men who worked the early corners of Harlem, the runners, the lookouts, the newspaper vendors, hunched their shoulders into their coats and said very little to one another. The message arrived at 8:15 a.m. Not a phone call. A note. Folded once, handed to a young man named Calvin who ran numbers on 131st Street, pressed into his palm by one of Dutch Schultz's men outside a diner on 8th Avenue. The man, broad, white and unhurried, told Calvin to deliver it to Edgecombe Avenue. Then he turned and walked away without waiting for a reply. Calvin ran. By 9 a.m. word had already moved ahead of him. It spread the way serious news always spreads through Harlem, not through newspapers or radio but through the living circulatory system of the community itself. A whispered exchange at Anderson's barbershop on Lenox Avenue. A sharp look passed between two men on the steps of Abyssinian Baptist Church on 138th Street. A conversation that stopped mid-sentence in the back room of Small's Paradise when a runner came through the door with his hat in his hands and his face arranged into something that looked almost like grief. Dutch Schultz put a price on Queenie's head. $5,000. In a Harlem where a working man earned $7 a week when he was lucky enough to have work at all, where families of 5 shared single rooms and prayed the rent collector would accept half until Friday, $5,000 was not a number. It was a declaration. It was Dutch Schultz standing in the street outside the most powerful woman in Harlem's territory, pointing at her building and saying, "She is finished. Whoever finishes her gets paid." He had given her 3 chances. 3 separate meetings. 3 separate ultimatums, each delivered by men who arrived at her door with the particular confidence of people who had never been told no by someone they couldn't threaten into silence. 3 times Stephanie St. Clair had listened. 3 times she had sent them away with nothing. This was his answer. By 9:30 a.m., Calvin reached 409 Edgecombe Avenue, a limestone building in Sugar Hill where the streets ran quieter, where the addresses meant something, where a black woman who had built herself into an empire lived on an upper floor above the city that had spent 20 years trying to bury her. He was let in by her housekeeper. He waited in the front hall, hat turning in his hands. Stephanie came out in a house dress and pearl earrings. She looked at Calvin. She took the note. She unfolded it, read it once, the way a person reads something they have been expecting, and folded it again along the original crease. "Thank you, Calvin," she said. He waited. For anger. For alarm. For something in her face that matched the fear that had been chasing him up Edgecombe Avenue for the last 20 minutes. There was nothing like that. She turned and walked back down the hall toward her study. At her mahogany desk, the morning light falling flat and cold through the window, Stephanie St. Clair set the folded notice at the top right corner of her blotter, beside a ledger and a stack of correspondence she had been working through since 6 o'clock. She sat down. She straightened the edge of the note with 2 fingers until it was perfectly aligned with the corner of the desk. Then she reached for the telephone. Martinique. The island was French by ownership and Caribbean by soul, a place where sugarcane grew tall along the windward coast and the colonizers built their homes on the high ground above Fort-de-France harbor, looking down at everything they had decided belonged to them. The markets smelled of sea salt and ripe mango. The churches rang bells in French. And the people who had been there longest, whose grandparents had been brought there in chains, moved through the streets with a particular kind of watchfulness, reading the room, measuring the distance between what was permitted and what was possible. Stephanie was born into that lower ground. And she spent her childhood learning to read it. She watched how the French administrators dismissed Caribbean women in the market, looking past them, through them, as though the transaction were occurring with no one in particular. She watched how money moved. Who held it, who extracted it, who was never allowed to keep it. She watched how power announced itself, in the cut of a coat, the angle of a gaze, the deliberate unhurriedness of a man who knows he will not be interrupted. And she filed all of it away the way a person files things they intend to use later. She arrived in New York in 1912, 26 years old. A French-speaking Caribbean woman with a slight accent, a secondary education that most of her Harlem neighbors would never have access to, and a clarity about the world that had been sharpened on the whetstone of colonial life. She had very little money. She had no connections. She had, by the reckoning of every institution that would soon attempt to categorize and dismiss her, nothing. Harlem in 1912 was not yet the Harlem the world would come to know. The Great Migration had begun its long pull northward, but the decade that would crown the borough as the cultural capital of Black America was still several years away. The streets were dense and loud and full of ambition and precarity in equal measure. Men who had fled the Jim Crow South arrived carrying everything they owned and found a city that was only marginally less hostile. Jobs were scarce. Wages were an insult. Landlords charged double what they charged downtown and provided half what they promised. Stephanie worked, cleaned houses, took in laundry, washed. She was not waiting for opportunity. She was studying the architecture of the city, who owned what, who owed whom, which men ran which blocks, which police captains could be negotiated with and which could not. She read every newspaper she could find. She sat in lecture halls at the 135th Street branch of the New York Public Library and listened to speakers who talked about economics and politics and law with the kind of precision that most schools refused to teach black students. By 1920, she had built her first operation. It began quietly, the way all durable things begin, not with a declaration but with a structure. Harlem's numbers game was already running when Stephanie entered it, operated by scattered independent men with loose organizations and no particular loyalty to the community they extracted money from. Stephanie saw the inefficiency immediately. She saw what it could be if it were run with discipline, with protection built in, with the runners treated as employees rather than disposable parts. She paid her runners fairly. She paid them on time. In a city where a black man could spend a week working for a white employer and receive 2/3 of what was promised, or nothing, Stephanie St. Clair's operation was an anomaly. Word traveled. Men came to work for her not just because the money was reliable, but because she treated them like human beings. She learned their names, their families, their circumstances. Within 4 years she had over 40 runners operating across Harlem, from 110th Street up to 145th, from 5th Avenue west to Amsterdam. By the mid-1920s, the operation was generating more than $40,000 a month. Not all of that was profit. Overhead was substantial: runners' wages, legal fees, payments to officers who required management, and the quiet but steady stream of money she directed back into the community that sustained her. Every Friday envelopes went out. Quietly. No announcement. Families who had fallen behind on rent, whose breadwinners were sick or out of work, found envelopes slipped under their doors or left with neighbors. No name on the outside. No expectation of repayment. It was not charity as the settlement houses practiced it, conditional, documented, laced with condescension. It was simply money from someone who had more of it than she needed that week, to someone who needed it to survive. Every Sunday, Stephanie sat in the third row of Abyssinian Baptist Church on 138th Street. She wore her best clothes. She listened to the sermons. When the collection plate came around, she gave generously, not for the recognition, but because the church was one of the few institutions in Harlem that answered to no white authority, and Stephanie understood instinctively what was worth protecting. By 1928, she was known throughout Harlem as Madame St. Clair. Some called her Queenie. Both names were accurate in their own way. She was not merely a criminal operator. She was a fixed point, a reference. When a landlord illegally evicted a tenant on Lenox Avenue, the tenant's family sometimes found their way to Stephanie before they found their way to the courts, because Stephanie's reach was faster and her results more reliable. When a young man from the neighborhood needed work and every door had been closed to him, he might find himself employed as a runner by the end of the week, with a wage and a clear set of rules and the understanding that Madame St. Clair's protection came with the job. She was not sentimental about any of it. That was the part people misunderstood. There were nights, late after the last phone call had been made and the ledger balanced and the apartment gone quiet around her, when the weight of it settled in. The loneliness of a position no one had held before her. The particular exhaustion of a woman who had to be twice as sharp, twice as prepared, twice as unreadable as any man in the same room. No one in her world occupied the same coordinates she did. Immigrant, Caribbean, black, woman, empire builder, community pillar, fugitive from every convention that had been designed to contain her. There was no map for where she was standing. She had drawn the map herself. Which meant that when Dutch Schultz looked at her in 1932 and saw a problem he could price at $5,000, he was not looking at a woman who had survived on luck or charm, or the protection of powerful men. He was looking at 20 years of deliberate, methodical construction. 20 years of intelligence gathered and stored and cross-referenced. 20 years of a community that did not merely tolerate Stephanie St. Clair, but considered her, in every practical sense that mattered, their own. That is what $5,000 was supposed to be enough to destroy. Dutch Schultz did not arrive in Harlem the way dangerous men usually arrive, loudly, visibly, with a statement intended to be remembered. He arrived the way floodwater arrives. Quietly, at the edges first, almost imperceptibly, until one morning you looked down and realized the floor was already wet. His real name was Arthur Flegenheimer. He was born in the Bronx in 1902 to a German Jewish family, and by the time Prohibition handed ambitious men their opportunity, he had already learned the essential lesson of his world: that violence was most effective when it was unexpected, and that the most durable empires were built not on loyalty but on fear. He ran beer distribution routes across the Bronx and Upper Manhattan through the 1920s, eliminating competitors with a casualness that unnerved even the men who worked for him. By 1929, the Bronx numbers racket, a territory that generated close to $20,000 a week, had been folded into his operation with barely a public whisper. He looked at Harlem and saw the logical next step. The first approach came in the spring of 1931. Not from Schultz himself, he did not yet believe the situation required his personal attention, but from his lieutenant, Bo Weinberg, who arrived at a meeting arranged through a mutual intermediary on 125th Street and made Stephanie St. Clair an offer she was meant to accept without negotiation. Schultz would take 60% of the Harlem numbers operation. Stephanie would retain 40%. She would continue to manage the runners, collect the slips, maintain the community relationships that made the whole machinery function. She would simply no longer own what she had built. Weinberg laid it out with the practiced patience of a man explaining terms to someone who had no meaningful alternative. Stephanie listened. She let him finish. Then she told him no. Weinberg blinked. He had not prepared for no. He restated the offer, as though she might have misunderstood. She told him no again. He left. 3 weeks later, a second meeting was arranged and a second offer made, this time with an implicit clarification about what refusal would eventually cost her. Stephanie told that messenger no as well. By the time a third approach arrived in October of 1931, delivered by a different man entirely at a restaurant on 7th Avenue, Schultz had begun to understand that the woman was not confused about his offer, not waiting for better terms, not operating from a position of ignorance about who he was. She simply did not intend to give him anything. That was when he changed his method. The pressure began in January of 1932, and it was designed to be invisible, a slow suffocation rather than a direct assault. Schultz's men began appearing at the collections points where Stephanie's runners gathered slips along Lenox Avenue and 135th Street, not threatening anyone directly, simply standing nearby, watching, making their presence felt. Bettors who saw them stopped coming. Runners who were approached quietly, offered $20 to report on pickup times and collection routes, sometimes accepted. Not out of disloyalty, but out of the ordinary human arithmetic of poverty. A family with no heat and a week's worth of food left will make calculations that a comfortable man judges too easily from a distance. Then came the raids. Between February and April of 1932, Stephanie's operations were raided 7 times. The warrants originated out of the 32nd Precinct on West 135th Street, a building where at least 3 officers had, by that spring, begun supplementing their city salaries with weekly envelopes from Schultz's organization. The raids were choreographed to arrive at moments of maximum disruption. Midday collections, Friday payouts, the Tuesday morning when 4 of her senior runners were in the same building on 131st Street for a routine accounting meeting. Evidence was planted. Arrests were made. 2 of her men spent time in the tombs before lawyers Stephanie retained at her own considerable expense secured their releases. Each raid cost her. Not just in legal fees and lost collections, though those numbers were real and mounting, but in something harder to quantify: uncertainty. The particular anxiety that spreads through an organization when the people inside it begin to wonder whether the protection they were promised is still reliable. Schultz was not trying to destroy Stephanie St. Clair outright. He was trying to make her exhausting to work for. And underneath all of it ran a current of assumption that informed every tactic he chose. It was not something any of his men would have stated directly, but it shaped every calculation nonetheless. That a black Caribbean woman, operating without the backing of an established male organization, without the implicit protections that came with being connected to the Italian families or the Jewish syndicates, was ultimately a temporary condition. That she had risen as far as a woman in her position could reasonably be expected to rise, and that the natural order of things, the order that men like Arthur Flegenheimer had always navigated and always benefited from, would reassert itself in time. He did not account for what she had already built that he couldn't see. While Schultz's men watched her collection points, Stephanie was watching his. While his officers at the 32nd Precinct filed fabricated warrants, she was cataloging the names of every officer involved, cross-referencing them against payroll records she had obtained through channels Schultz didn't know existed. While his runners circled her territory, her own people, quiet, careful, entirely invisible to anyone looking for them, had already made contact with 3 men inside Schultz's Bronx operation who had reasons of their own to be cooperative. She told no one what she was building. Not yet. She kept it in the files. The growing, methodical, cross-reference files that lived in a locked cabinet in her Sugar Hill apartment, growing heavier by the week. She was not panicking. She was not retreating. She was waiting for him to make one more mistake. The bounty was a mistake. Not because it failed to frighten people. It did frighten people. Harlem felt it like a temperature drop, a sudden collective awareness that the conflict between Madame St. Clair and Dutch Schultz had crossed into territory that couldn't be walked back. But fear, in Stephanie's calculation, was not the problem. Fear was manageable. Fear was even useful if you understood how to redirect it. The mistake was that the bounty was a public declaration. And public declarations leave evidence. 4 months, since at least the spring of 1932, Stephanie had been building toward a moment that required Schultz to overreach. To do something documented, something witnessed, something that existed in the world outside the invisible backroom negotiations of the New York underworld and entered the realm of things a federal investigator could hold in his hands and take before a grand jury. She had understood, with the patience of someone who had been playing long games since before Dutch Schultz had his first illegal beer route, that she could not beat him by matching his violence. She had no army equal to his. She had no political connections as deeply embedded. She had no Italian family alliance, no Jewish syndicate backing, no 20-year institutional infrastructure of citywide corruption propping up her position. What she had was better. She had information. And she had been collecting it piece by piece for a very long time. The first piece had come from a man named Roosevelt Webb. Webb was a numbers runner in the South Bronx, a quiet, methodical man in his early 40s who had worked Schultz's operation since 1929 and had, by the summer of 1931, developed serious reservations about the direction of his employer's ambitions. He had watched 2 men he considered friends disappear after questioning Schultz's expansion plans. He had been present, involuntarily, at a meeting where the decision to move on Harlem was discussed with a casual contempt for the people who lived there that had settled in his chest like something he couldn't dislodge. Webb had a cousin in Harlem. The cousin knew a woman who did laundry for one of Stephanie's senior runners. The introduction, when it finally happened in October of 1931, took place in the back of a dry goods store on 132nd Street. Stephanie arrived alone, on time, and said very little for the first 20 minutes. She let Webb talk. She asked 3 questions, all of them precise, none of them the questions he had expected. Then she told him what she needed and what she would provide in return. Not money, or not only money, but the guarantee that when the time came, his name would not appear in any document, any filing, any newspaper story. He would be invisible. And his family in the Bronx would be left entirely alone. Webb became her first window into Schultz's operation. Over the following months, 2 more men inside Schultz's organization found their way, through separate, unconnected paths that Stephanie had deliberately kept separate, to the same arrangement. She never allowed them to know about each other. 3 independent sources, each providing their own piece of the picture, each unaware of the other's existence, each with their own reasons for cooperation that had nothing to do with loyalty to Stephanie and everything to do with their own private accounting of where the future was headed. 3 separate men. 3 separate stories. All telling the same thing. What they told her was specific and damning. Dutch Schultz ran a cash operation that generated, conservatively, $12 million per year across his combined Bronx and Manhattan territories. None of it was declared. Not a dollar. In the years since Prohibition had made him wealthy, Arthur Flegenheimer had paid federal income taxes on sums that bore no relationship to his actual earnings, reporting income that an accountant at the Bureau of Internal Revenue would recognize immediately as fiction, if that accountant were ever given reason to look closely enough. The IRS had already begun to look closely. Quietly, since early 1932, federal investigators had been building a preliminary case around Schultz's financial activities, a case that was real but incomplete, suffering from the particular evidentiary problem that plagued all such investigations. The numbers existed, but the documentation trail that would make them prosecutable before a jury was still thin. Stephanie had the documentation. Over the course of 11 months, she had assembled a file that occupied 2 inches of a locked cabinet drawer in her Sugar Hill apartment. It contained 12 handwritten ledger pages transcribed by Webb and one other source, detailing weekly cash figures from 6 of Schultz's collection operations between January and September of 1932, with dates and amounts. It contained records of 8 separate cash payments made to officers at the 28th and 32nd precincts, names, ranks, dollar amounts, and in 3 cases the locations where the exchanges occurred. It contained a sworn, signed statement from a man who had personally witnessed Schultz's bookkeeper preparing the fraudulent federal returns that were filed in 1930 and 1931. She knew what she had. She had known for months. She had been waiting for the right moment and the right contact. A federal investigator who was already interested, already building, and who needed exactly what she possessed to move from preliminary inquiry to indictment. In September of 1932, through a lawyer she trusted named Charles Roberts who maintained careful relationships on both sides of the law's formal boundaries, she made discreet contact with investigators at the Bureau of Internal Revenue's New York field office. The meeting that followed was not dramatic. It took place in an office on Worth Street in Lower Manhattan, lasted 40 minutes, and involved Stephanie saying almost nothing while her lawyer spoke. She had prepared a summary document, 3 pages, precise, organized by date and category, and she left a copy on the table when she stood to leave. She did not ask for anything in return. She did not need to. The value of what she had handed them was self-evident, and the investigators in that room understood that the woman who had just provided them with the clearest picture of Dutch Schultz's financial operation they had yet seen had not done so out of civic obligation. She had done it because it served her purpose at a specific moment in a conflict they were only beginning to understand the full dimensions of. She was content to let them think they were using her. The second weapon was the New York-Amsterdam News. Stephanie had maintained a relationship with the paper's editorial staff for years. Not a transactional relationship, not the relationship of a criminal buying favorable coverage, but something more nuanced and more durable. She was a source. When corruption in the 32nd precinct affected Harlem residents, she had provided documentation. When a Harlem landlord illegally evicted a family and the courts moved too slowly, the Amsterdam News sometimes received an anonymous package with enough evidence to run a story that accelerated the legal process considerably. The editors knew where the packages came from. They never said so publicly. In November of 1932, the week after the bounty was posted, Stephanie placed a private telephone call to an editor she had worked with for 4 years. She told him she had a story. She told him the broad shape of it, a white organized crime figure systematically targeting black-owned businesses in Harlem, using corrupt police officers as instruments of that campaign, with documentation to support every claim. She told him she would provide names, figures, and corroborating witnesses when she was ready. He told her he would hold space on the front page. Through all of it, Ellsworth Johnson, the young man from South Carolina who had come to work for Stephanie 3 years earlier and whom Harlem was beginning to call Bumpy, remained close. He was 27 years old, broad-shouldered, and possessed of a particular quality of stillness that men who understood violence recognized immediately as dangerous. He ran the physical side of Stephanie's operation, the collections, the security, the quiet but unmistakable presence that ensured her runners moved through Harlem without being touched by anyone who understood what they were looking at. Stephanie trusted him. She also kept him carefully separated from what she was building. Not because she doubted his loyalty, she didn't, but because what she was assembling was not a fight that muscle could finish, and she needed Bumpy exactly where he was, visible, present, and available to anyone watching Stephanie's operation to find and misread. While Schultz's men tracked Bumpy's movements and made their assessments about Stephanie's defensive posture, she was operating on an entirely different plane, one they were not equipped to observe because it did not occur in the streets. It occurred in locked rooms, in telephone calls, in files. By November 14, 1932, 6 days after the bounty had been posted across Harlem, the architecture was complete. The federal investigators had her documents. The Amsterdam News was ready. The 3 sources inside Schultz's organization were in place. The evidence file was copied, with one copy held by Charles Roberts at his office on 125th Street and the original locked in Stephanie's cabinet at Edgecombe Avenue. Every piece was positioned. Every contact activated. Every line of pressure converging on the same point from directions Schultz had never thought to watch. She had built a trap inside a trap inside a trap. All she needed now was to close it. November 15, 1932. A Sunday. Stephanie St. Clair rose at 5:30 in the morning, dressed carefully, and sat at her mahogany desk as the first pale light came through the windows of her Sugar Hill apartment. She had slept 4 hours. She did not require more. On the desk in front of her were 3 sealed envelopes, a fountain pen, and the telephone she had been reaching for since the morning Calvin delivered the folded notice 7 days earlier. She looked at the envelopes for a moment. Then she picked up the telephone. The first call went to Charles Roberts, her lawyer, at his home on St. Nicholas Avenue. He answered on the second ring. He had been expecting it. She told him it was time. 2 words. He said he understood. The call lasted 11 seconds. The second call went to the Amsterdam News. The third envelope she did not send by telephone. She handed it in person to a man named Darnell Cooper, one of her most trusted senior runners, a man who had worked for her since 1924 and whose discretion she had tested across 8 years and never found wanting. She told him where it needed to go. She told him it needed to arrive by noon. She told him it was not to leave his hands until it reached the specific individual named on the outside. The name on the outside was Arthur Flegenheimer. Darnell Cooper looked at the envelope. He looked at Stephanie. He put the envelope inside his coat, buttoned it, and left without another word. Stephanie sat back in her chair. Outside, Harlem was waking up. The New York Amsterdam News ran the story on Wednesday, November 18, 1932. It appeared on the front page, below the fold, not the screaming headline of a tabloid scandal, but the measured, documented language of a paper that understood its community depended on it to be believed. The headline read, "White crime ring targets Harlem businesses, police corruption documented." The story named Dutch Schultz's operation by structure and financial scale. It named the 32nd precinct specifically. It cited 3 sources, unnamed but described with enough precision that anyone inside the situation knew exactly who they were and what they had witnessed. It included dollar figures. It included dates. It included the specific locations of 4 raids conducted under fabricated warrants between February and April of that year. It did not name Stephanie St. Clair anywhere in its text. By 9 o'clock that morning, the paper had sold out at every newsstand on Lenox Avenue between 110th and 145th Streets. By 10, people were reading borrowed copies on stoops and in barbershops and at the counter of the diner on 135th Street where Schultz's man had handed Calvin the bounty notice 11 days earlier. There was something different in the way Harlem moved that morning. A loosening, a collective exhale, the particular relief of a community that had been holding its breath and was now watching something shift in a direction it had not been certain was possible. People understood. Not all of it, not the full architecture. But enough. Someone had moved against Dutch Schultz with documentation. In a city where powerful white men operated with a reliable assumption of impunity, someone had found a way to make the machinery visible. No one said her name out loud. They didn't need to. The package that arrived at the Bureau of Internal Revenue's New York field office on Worth Street on the morning of November 16, delivered by Charles Roberts in person in a leather briefcase, with a cover letter signed by Roberts on firm letterhead, ran to 41 pages. It contained everything Stephanie had assembled over 11 months, the transcribed ledger figures, the bribery payment records, the sworn statement from the witness to Schultz's fraudulent tax filings, and a 2-page organizational summary that mapped the structure of Schultz's entire financial operation with the clarity of someone who had been studying it from the inside for almost a year. Roberts left the package, shook hands with the senior investigator who received it, and departed. He did not wait for a response. There was no need. The investigators who opened that briefcase that afternoon already knew what they had been missing. They had been building a house without a foundation. Stephanie St. Clair had just delivered the foundation, poured and set and ready to build on. The federal tax case against Arthur Flegenheimer, which had been moving at the cautious pace of an investigation without sufficient documentation, began to accelerate within the week. The third envelope reached its destination at noon as instructed. Darnell Cooper delivered it to an intermediary at a pool hall on Westchester Avenue in the Bronx, a man who worked in close proximity to Schultz's operation and who received it with an expression that suggested he understood, from the weight and the formality of it, that the envelope was not something to be opened casually or in company. He carried it personally to the address where Schultz was known to conduct business that afternoon. Inside was a single document. 4 pages. Typed on Stephanie's typewriter, the heavy underwood that sat on the left side of her desk, and unsigned. It began without preamble. It listed, in clean columns, the names of every man inside Schultz's organization who had provided information to Stephanie's network over the preceding 11 months. It listed the dates of their contacts and the nature of the information provided. It listed the names of 8 police officers at the 28th and 32nd precincts who had accepted payments from Schultz's operation, with the amounts, the dates, and the locations of the exchanges. It listed the specific dollar figures from 6 of his collection operations, cross-referenced against the income he had declared to federal authorities. The final paragraph read in its entirety. This information has been provided to the Bureau of Internal Revenue and to the press. It cannot be recalled. The individuals named herein cannot be silenced. What you attempted to purchase with $5,000 was not available at any price. This matter is concluded. No signature. No return address. No threat. No demand. Just an accounting. Clean, complete, and irrefutable. The bounty was withdrawn on November 19, 1932. There was no announcement. No message sent to Stephanie. No intermediary dispatched with an explanation or a counteroffer or even an acknowledgement that the bounty had existed. It simply ceased. The men who had been watching her building on Edgecombe Avenue were no longer there when the sun came up that Thursday morning. The pressure on her collection routes on Lenox Avenue stopped. The officers at the 32nd Precinct who had been engineering raids against her operations did not file another fabricated warrant. The silence arrived like weather, not as a single event but as a condition, a changed atmosphere noticed first at the edges and then everywhere at once. Word moved through New York's underworld with the speed that serious information always travels in close communities. The Italian families operating out of Lower Manhattan, who had been watching the Schultz-St. Clair conflict with a detached assessment of men calculating whose position they might eventually need to negotiate with, drew their own conclusions from the sequence of events. A federal investigation activated. A front-page exposé in a major newspaper. A bounty quietly retracted with no public explanation. They were men who understood power. They understood what they were looking at. In the back rooms and the private dining rooms and the offices where New York's organized networks made their actual decisions, Dutch Schultz's miscalculation was discussed in the careful, economical language of people who do not waste words. He had moved against a woman he had dismissed. He had escalated publicly. And she had responded on terrain he didn't know existed, with weapons he hadn't known she was carrying, through channels he hadn't known to watch. Nobody laughed. Nobody celebrated. Nobody said her name with contempt again. They went quiet. The kind of quiet that, in that world, was its own form of acknowledgement. Stephanie St. Clair sat in her apartment on Edgecombe Avenue that Thursday evening and listened to it. The silence. She had earned every inch of it. The winter of 1932 moved into 1933 the way winters do in New York, without ceremony, without formal acknowledgement that anything had changed. The coal smoke still rose from the basement furnaces. The streetcars still ran on Lenox Avenue. The families who had been struggling before November were still struggling in December. But something in Harlem had shifted. Quietly. Permanently. Stephanie's runners moved through their routes without interference. The fabricated warrants stopped coming out of the 32nd Precinct. The men who had stationed themselves at her collection points on 135th Street were gone. The territory that Dutch Schultz had spent the better part of 2 years attempting to suffocate, through bribery, through police corruption, through the blunt instrument of a $5,000 bounty, was intact. More than intact. The attempt to take it had, in the strange calculus of power, made it stronger. Communities that had watched and waited to see whether Madame St. Clair could hold had their answer. The envelopes still arrived on Friday evenings. The third-row pew at Abyssinian Baptist remained occupied every Sunday. Nothing that mattered had moved an inch. Arthur Flegenheimer's decline was not immediate. It was architectural. The way a building weakens before it falls, stress fractures spreading invisibly through the structure long before the collapse becomes visible from the outside. The federal tax indictment came in January of 1933, precisely the trajectory that the Bureau of Internal Revenue's accelerated investigation had been heading toward since Charles Roberts delivered that 41-page briefcase to Worth Street. Schultz spent the next 2 years in a grinding legal battle, a first trial in Syracuse in 1934 ending in a hung jury, a second in Malone, New York in 1935 ending in acquittal, both proceedings consuming enormous sums of money and, more critically, enormous quantities of attention and goodwill from the organized networks whose tolerance he depended upon. He became a liability. A man who drew federal scrutiny. A man who, in the compressed and paranoid logic of the National Crime Syndicate, could no longer be trusted to make careful decisions. When Schultz announced his intention to assassinate Special Prosecutor Thomas E. Dewey, a move the syndicate's leadership viewed as catastrophically reckless, an action that would bring federal pressure down on every organized operation in the country, the decision was made with the same businesslike efficiency that characterized all such decisions in that world. On October 23, 1935, Dutch Schultz was shot at the Palace Chop House in Newark, New Jersey. He died the following morning. He was 33 years old. Stephanie St. Clair sent a telegram to his hospital bed. It read, "As ye sow, so shall ye reap." 6 words. No signature. None was necessary. It was the only public statement she ever made about Dutch Schultz. It was enough. Through the grinding years of the Depression, years that emptied Harlem's savings and closed its businesses and pushed families already living at the edge into something below it, Stephanie's operation remained one of the few reliable economic engines the community possessed. The numbers game was not merely gambling in a neighborhood where hope was scarce. It was the weekly ritual of imagining a different morning, and the weekly reality that someone's number would come in, that a family would make rent, that a child would have shoes for September. Stephanie understood this. She had always understood it. She had built her empire on the understanding that her interests and her community's interests were not separate things. The Depression decade also brought its complications. Her marriage to Sufi Abdul Hamid, a charismatic and controversial figure in Harlem's political landscape, proved to be one of the few battles of her life that her intelligence could not fully navigate. It ended badly, publicly, in a way that cost her something she rarely lost: her composure. She served time. She endured the particular indignity of a woman whose private life was held to a standard her male counterparts were never asked to meet. She emerged from it diminished in the eyes of some, unchanged in the estimation of those who had watched her for 20 years. She retired from the numbers business in the early 1960s. By then, Harlem had changed around her, the old architecture of the numbers racket disrupted by new pressures, new operators, a world that had moved on from the particular economy of the Depression and Prohibition eras that had made her possible. She died in 1969, 83 years old. A Caribbean immigrant who had arrived in New York with nothing and built, by force of intelligence and will and a refusal to accept the categories the world assigned her, something that outlasted everyone who had tried to take it. There is no monument to Stephanie St. Clair on Lenox Avenue. No school bears her name. No official history claims her readily. The mainstream record, built by people who had reasons to minimize what she represented, filed her under criminal and moved on. But Harlem remembered. In the particular way communities remember the people who stood between them and erasure, not in bronze or marble but in the stories told in barbershops, in the details passed from grandmother to granddaughter, in the quiet understanding of what it cost and what it meant for a black Caribbean woman to stand in the middle of 1930s New York and refuse to move. $5,000. That was the price Dutch Schultz put on Stephanie St. Clair. He could not have known what she was worth.